But fortunately for us, apparently Jesus wasn't a literalist either. All this talk, this rather macabre talk in Mark's Gospel about cutting off body parts, was obviously just to get our attention, right? Seems to be an intentionally exaggerated response to the out-of-control fear of the disciples. Fears that were causing them to make feverish attempts to control their world more and more tightly. Last Sunday, you may remember in our gospel reading, the disciples were arguing over who was the greatest in response to Jesus' words about suffering. And this week, they're making lists of who's in and who's out of Jesus' circle. But before we get down on those disciples, maybe we should take a look at our own behavior of late. Have you noticed? There seems to be a lot of fear rising to the surface in our culture and bubbling over in ways that are dividing us ever more deeply. It seems that many of us are agitated and irritable. I find myself to be that way a lot lately. It feels like we're on edge as a society. Is it political polarization, in which constant campaign ads pit us against one another that has us on edge? Is it continuing economic fatigue and anxiety? Is it our fears that our group, whatever that group may be, is being displaced and will no longer be able to call the shots in a more pluralistic America? Like the disciples in Mark's Gospel, we seem suspicious of anyone who's not part of our group, even if they're doing something that by all objective accounts is adding to the healing of the world. How do we get here? And how do we get out? Well, as much as we dislike the current state of affairs, we're probably not going to like the answer that I think Jesus is giving us about how we're to get out. It's salt. But unlike most of current medical wisdom, Jesus happens to think that we need more of it, not less. Now, again, Jesus is speaking, I think, in metaphor here. Jesus is a prophetic poet, not a biologist. Yet even before modern science could analyze the makeup of the human body, Jesus seems to intuitively know that salt was and is an essential part of who we are. It's part of our makeup. In Jesus' day, before the advent of BHA and BHT and TBHQ and what other awful chemical stuff gets pumped into our food, salt, plain old salt, was the primary food preservative. When I was a child, I loved it when my parents and I would get one of my grandfather Bissette's cured hams from the smokehouse. There was no better breakfast to me than country ham, eggs, grits, and biscuits with red-eye gravy. What a way to start today. I assumed that the ham had been rubbed down in salt to give it that wonderful flavor that I really love and still do. Later I learned in chemistry that the salt was there in order to safely preserve the meat. If you and I, as the contemporary followers of Jesus, are to be the salt of the earth as he encourages us to be, might that at least partly mean that we are to preserve that which is life-giving in the world? Might it mean that we are called to preserve the dignity of our neighbor? Might it mean that we are called to preserve the innate unity of all creation and of all humankind? not in simplistic ways that ignore the nuance of the fluid and changing realities of people and communities, but rather in soulful ways that hold up the core values of compassion and justice and community that give life to our world. That's not an easy thing to do, to be that kind of preservative in our society today. But what we are not called to preserve, I think, is the status quo. Because a second quality of salt is its ability to enhance the flavor of food. It can give food that is otherwise bland that extra bit of pizzazz. Flavored salt can offer a bite to our bite, if you will. And salty people can offer a needed bite to those glazed over places of denial in which our culture so often lives. I'm one of those who believes that the mainline church is losing members primarily because its message has become as bland as mashed potatoes. It has become a place where fairly prosperous people gather to comfort one another. Now, hear me out. I don't think that's a bad and unnecessary thing. Comfort is good. But in and of itself, if we stop there, then we have stopped, I think, following the Jesus of the Gospels, whose whole life was about living with the marginalized and lifting up the poor and the oppressed of his day. Some churches have tried to bring back some pizzazz to the life of the church by selling Starbucks coffee in the lobby before worship, taking those unsettling crosses out of our sanctuaries and telling their flock that God wants them to be prosperous. Instead, I'd like to propose that we jazz up the church by embracing the salty, prophetic ministry of Jesus. And that will include talking about the hard issues of our day, but not only talking about them, but doing so in a way that will lead us to deeper action in the world. I agree with UCC pastor and scholar Robin Myers, a pastor who will be in our midst in May, when he counters the myth that political talk has no place in spiritual communities. The partisan politics of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, has no place in the church. That is true. But, to quote Myers, Jesus was political. He was a dangerous and subversive. Not because he wanted to help individuals escape a perishing world and make it up to heaven, but because he wanted to bring heaven's justice down to earth, especially to free those who suffered injustice and oppression. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray for the coming reign of God on earth as it is in heaven, it was all too evident to the current rulers of that day. If this really were to happen, they would be displaced. So I would add that it wasn't preaching a message of salvation in heaven that got Jesus killed. That doesn't seem to threaten anybody, does it? It was preaching a message of salvation on earth for which Jesus lost his life, and for which we are challenged to stick our necks out for as Jesus' followers and current-day disciples. We have to talk about the hell of poverty, and the hell of child abuse, and the hell of discrimination, and then we have to do something about it during the week if we are to pray the Lord's Prayer with any kind of integrity on Sunday morning. And believe me, that's just as hard for me to hear as I can imagine it is for you to hear. Last Sunday, we entered into the hard work of talking with one another about the possibility of making a public justice witness. We are considering whether to say no out loud to the oppression of gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people by our society. We may choose to make this witness by becoming an official, open, and affirming congregation within the United Church of Christ. Or we may choose to continue to make this witness in some other way that we have not yet imagined as we deepen our lives together as community. But I want you to know, as you saw last Sunday, I am moved to tears that we are having this brave conversation. This conversation that I pray will lead us to some form of deeper, committed action in the world, some way to be salt in the earth. But this is in no way to suggest that this is the only justice issue we are called to address. Far from it. And to paraphrase our illustrious chair of council, who's not here this morning, so I can quote her and she won't know if I was accurate. But I think those of us at council heard Kathy say something like this: we're gifted folks, and we can actually do more than one thing at a time. And I believe she's right. We are living out our commitment to racial justice and healing as we engage a deepening relationship with Spalding. And I know that it's deepening because I am hearing some of you come to me and tell me of encounters you are having in the community with folk at Spalding that have enriched your life. And that is what this is all about, is for us to take it out there, not just to talk about it here. And almost 2 years ago now, maybe more, we raised almost $10,000 to build a school in the Muslim country of Mali, Africa. And in the process of writing this sermon this week and buying a birthday present for my daughter Abby, who just turned 22, Lord, I have felt the living Jesus speaking to me about being salt in new ways. In April, this church turns 25 years old. But friends, we may be young in years, but we are not small in our transformative potential in this community. I'm hearing Jesus call to be the salty prophetic bite in our world with new commitment. So, I'm going to step out just a little bit this morning. I did run this by the chair of our Mission, Peace, and Justice team, and he nodded, so I'm going to take that as I want to invite you, I want to invite us to join me in imagining how it is that we can work together to change the injustice of poverty in days to come. I've decided that if I can spend $50 on a birthday present for my daughter, who doesn't need a thing from me but my love, then I can give at least that much in the coming year to someone else's son or daughter who doesn't have the physical essentials of food and shelter. So, on this year of our 25th birthday, let's commit ourselves together to find a collective way to contribute at least $2,500, $100 for each year of our church's existence, to address poverty in Moore County as this church's birthday gift to our community. I have an idea about how to do that I'll share with our Mission, Peace, and Justice team that is meeting this Tuesday. But if you have ideas, and I bet you do, I'm imagining that John Arnold will be glad to receive them. Right, John? Another nod, yes. But we can't just stop with money. To be the kind of salt that Jesus embodied, we have to work systemically as well so that the root causes of poverty are addressed and the cycle and not just the symptoms come to an end. So let's get busy. Let's get busy together imagining a new order for our community. Which leads me to the final primary characteristic of salt. Healing. Rubbing salt in a wound will sting at first, but it will contribute to its coming together. Soaking in a tub of salt water is good for a variety of ills. Sisters and brothers, we are called to be healing agents in a divided and wounded world. We are called to stand in the gaps, preserving dignity and prophetically subverting the status quo for the sake of the healing of the nations and the binding up of individual wounds. We are to be that community of compassion for one another and for the world. And counterintuitively, Jesus reminds us in exaggerated ways that we can only do that if we are willing to lop off the fears, the insecurities, the patience and the impatience, and the arrogance that keeps us from being agents of the kingdom of God. And that's hard to hear. That's the hard, challenging news of this word to us today. But the good, challenging news, and it is good news, and it is still challenging news. The good, challenging news, friends, is that we are the salt of the earth. We have the privilege of bearing forth healing in the world. Because Jesus lives in us, we have been given power to address the wars within ourselves, within our communities, and within our world. So friends, let us hear Jesus' word to us. Have salt within yourselves and be at peace with one another. Amen.